Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a place where every dollar you spent came right back to your community. A place where doctors, lawyers, and business owners who looked just like you were building generational wealth. This wasn't some dream. This was a real place in America in 1921. It was Greenwood, a district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, nicknamed Black Wall Street. Now, picture that same vibrant, successful, beating heart of a community being systematically destroyed. Not by a natural disaster, not by an enemy nation, but by its own neighbors. A tragedy so devastating, so violent, and so thoroughly buried in history that for decades, many Americans never even heard of it. This is the true story of how Black Wall Street burned. A story of incredible achievement, unfathomable terror, and a fight for memory that continues to this day. You need to hear this. To understand the horror of May 31st and June 1st, 1921, you first have to understand the miracle that was Greenwood. Picture early 20th century Tulsa, a booming oil town in Oklahoma. For many Black Americans looking for a new start, Oklahoma, especially after the Civil War, seemed like a promised land. It was one of the destinations for people leaving the harsh realities of the Deep South, escaping sharecropping and relentless violence. Tulsa's Greenwood district became the shining example of what was possible when African Americans were allowed to operate free of the suffocating prejudice that existed elsewhere. This wasn't just integration. This was pure economic self-determination. The catalyst for Greenwood's success was simple: necessity and solidarity. Because of the era's segregation, Black residents were essentially forced to do business with one another. What started as a limitation became their greatest strength. Money circulated within the community dozens of times before it ever left. You'd get your suit tailored by Mr. Smith, buy groceries from Mrs. Jones, and see Dr. Williams. All Black-owned businesses, all supporting each other. It was an economic engine. Greenwood Avenue, the main thoroughfare, was lined with elegant two-story brick buildings. There were 2 Black-owned newspapers, more than a dozen Black doctors, a luxury hotel, movie theaters, and even an operating bus line. Visitors called it Black Wall Street because of the sheer density of successful, flourishing businesses. It was a place of deep pride, a community that had pulled itself up by its own bootstraps and was creating real, lasting wealth. It was a beacon, and that beacon, unfortunately, became a target. The residents of Greenwood were not just surviving, they were thriving. While Greenwood was thriving, the surrounding white community in Tulsa was watching. And they weren't just watching, they were stewing. The success of Black Wall Street directly challenged the deep-seated racist beliefs of the time. The idea that Black Americans were inherently incapable of self-governance or achieving high-level economic success. It wasn't just a physical boundary that separated Greenwood from the rest of Tulsa. It was a wall of resentment, fear, and jealousy. Tulsa was a strictly segregated city. The lines were clearly drawn, not just in where you could live and work, but in social norms and expectations. The early 1920s were a particularly volatile time across the United States. World War I veterans, both Black and white, had returned home. Black veterans, who had fought and bled for their country, came back with a new sense of pride and a refusal to accept the old, degrading ways of segregation. This newfound assertiveness was seen as an unacceptable threat by many white Americans, especially those who were part of or influenced by the rapidly growing Ku Klux Klan. In Tulsa, the air was thick with tension. It was a perfect storm: a highly successful Black community, emboldened Black veterans, and a highly armed, fearful, and resentful white populace. All that was needed was a spark, and that spark would come on a day like any other, inside an elevator in a downtown building. The situation wasn't stable. It was a ticking time bomb, and everyone in Tulsa, Black and white, knew it. The question was not if it would explode, but when. The fuse was lit on May 30th, 1921. The setting was the Drexel Building downtown, which housed a department store. A 19-year-old Black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland entered an elevator operated by a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. What exactly happened in that small, enclosed space has been lost to history. Rowland may have tripped, accidentally stepping on her foot. He may have brushed her arm. Page later claimed Rowland grabbed her arm, but she refused to press charges. Regardless, the scream she let out led to Rowland's hasty arrest the next morning on charges of attempted assault. This was exactly the kind of incident that often led to quick and violent mob justice in the era. The story was immediately sensationalized by the Tulsa Tribune, a local white newspaper, which ran a front-page story with the inflammatory headline, possibly referencing an intended lynching. This was the match. Black Tulsans, acutely aware of the history of lynchings, where black men were often brutally murdered by mobs without a trial, were determined to prevent it. Around 7:30 p.m. on May 31st, a group of about 25 armed black men, many of them World War I veterans, drove to the courthouse where Rowland was being held to offer their protection. This action, a show of force to protect one of their own from mob violence, infuriated the growing crowd of white men gathered outside. The crowd had swelled to hundreds. A white man reportedly demanded a black veteran hand over his gun. A scuffle ensued, and a gun went off. That single shot was the beginning of the massacre. The fighting started, and soon, the white mob began gathering more weapons, heading directly toward the wealthy, proud district of Greenwood. As the gunfire erupted outside the courthouse, the white mob, which now numbered well over 1,000, quickly understood their goal was no longer just lynching Dick Rowland. It was about crushing black success. They had tasted blood and smelled opportunity. The initial handful of armed black veterans who had tried to defend Rowland were quickly overwhelmed and had to retreat back toward Greenwood. This was a tactical move, not a surrender. They intended to make their stand on their own turf, protecting their families and businesses. The invasion began shortly after 10 p.m. The mob didn't just march. They surged into the Greenwood district, breaking into pawn shops, hardware stores, and armories along the way to equip themselves with rifles and shotguns. The few dozen black defenders, men who had seen real combat in France, set up defensive positions. They tried to barricade the streets and fight back from rooftops, using their military experience to organize. For a brief, terrifying few hours, Greenwood was a war zone. The defenders, fighting for their homes and their lives, managed to slow the advance of the invading force. This resistance only fueled the mob's rage, turning their mission from a race riot into a systematic military-style campaign of destruction. The defenders were outmanned, outgunned, and facing an enemy that had the tacit support of many local authorities. Witnesses later described seeing police cars filled with white men carrying weapons. The authorities were not trying to stop the violence. In many cases, they were participating in it or actively disarming black residents who tried to protect themselves. The hope that the police or the National Guard would intervene to protect black citizens evaporated quickly. As the night wore on and the mob pushed deeper into Greenwood, the black defenders, recognizing the overwhelming numbers against them, realized they could no longer hold the line. Their defense shifted from stopping the enemy to buying time for their loved ones to escape the coming inferno. By the early morning hours of June 1st, the fighting had largely stopped being a battle and started being a massacre. Once the organized resistance was broken, the white mob became a force of pure, destructive chaos. Their primary weapon wasn't just the gun, it was fire. Systematic arson began almost immediately. Gangs of white men, and some women, went from building to building, pouring kerosene and setting Black Wall Street ablaze. They weren't just burning poor housing. They were destroying magnificent, successful, 2- and 3-story brick businesses, professional offices, and family homes. The air was soon thick with black smoke and the unbearable smell of burning wood, oil, and flesh. Eyewitnesses later recounted the chilling sight of looters first ransacking stores, taking jewelry, clothing, and cash, and then setting the buildings on fire with casual cruelty. If they found a black person hiding, they were often shot on sight or dragged out into the streets. The fire department, which was mostly white, showed up but reportedly refused to put out the fires in Greenwood, sometimes even being threatened at gunpoint by the mob if they tried. It was a deliberate, coordinated effort to wipe out the physical evidence of black success. For the residents trapped in Greenwood, the only choice was flight. They ran in their nightclothes, carrying whatever they could grab, a family photo, a small bag of valuables, or just their children. They were running through a gauntlet of flames and gunfire. The roar of the fire was deafening, occasionally punctuated by the terrifying sound of exploding oil tanks or the collapse of a major building. The furies were the sheer, unbridled racist hatred that drove the attackers. They were not just destroying buildings, they were destroying the hopes, dreams, and generational legacy of an entire community. The fire wasn't a byproduct of the violence, it was the main event. One of the most shocking and unique elements of the Tulsa Race Massacre was the use of aerial assault. Around dawn on June 1st, as the fires raged out of control, several private airplanes, owned by wealthy white Tulsans, took to the skies. This was America in 1921. The airplane was still a novel, almost miraculous invention, and here it was, being used as a weapon against American citizens. Survivors reported seeing these planes circling low over the Greenwood district. The accounts are chillingly consistent. The planes were not simply observing. They were actively participating. Some accounts describe the planes dropping kerosene-soaked incendiary devices, crude firebombs, onto the rooftops of businesses and homes that had not yet been fully consumed by the flames. Other reports detail attackers in the planes using rifles to fire down on black residents attempting to flee the burning district. Think about that for a moment. People were being hunted from the air. This aerial bombing was psychological warfare as much as physical destruction. It showed the residents of Greenwood that there was no safe place, not even the open street, and that the attackers had resources and a level of coordination far beyond a simple street mob. The use of planes cemented the military precision of the attack. It accelerated the rate of destruction, ensuring that virtually nothing in the 35-block district would be spared. This detail, the air attack, is often the hardest for people to grasp, but it underscores the calculated nature of the massacre. It was a clear message. We will use every means available to destroy what you have built. The planes were the final, terrifying punctuation mark on the destruction of Black Wall Street, turning a nightmare on the ground into a horror from the sky. For those who survived, the memory of the Tulsa Race Massacre is forever tied to the sounds of those terrifying hours. It wasn't just loud. It was a wall of noise that spoke of absolute destruction. First, there was the constant, horrifying crackle and roar of the fire. The flames consumed everything: wood, fabric, books, and the pride built over decades. The heat was so intense it forced people out of hiding and into the open streets. Mixed into this fiery orchestra was the ceaseless chorus of gunfire. It wasn't the neat, controlled sounds of a battlefield. It was erratic, close range, and everywhere. Rifle shots, shotgun blasts, and the piercing sound of pistols. People remembered the sound of bullets tearing into brick walls, shattering glass, and hitting human flesh. Then came the human sounds, the chilling screams of the injured, the desperate cries of parents trying to find their children in the smoke, and the maniacal shouts and laughter of the attackers. One of the most devastating sounds was the groan and crash of major structures collapsing. The elegant, two-story Dreamland Theater, the popular Stratford Hotel, and the bustling businesses along Greenwood Avenue. Each one fell with a terrifying finality. Every collapse was a physical and symbolic blow, silencing not just a building, but a piece of the community's future. The defenders who had fought so bravely were slowly silenced, their ammunition running out, their numbers dwindling. The noise was designed to terrorize, to ensure that anyone hiding would feel the absolute, crushing finality of the attack. It was the sound of a community being systematically erased, a sound that would echo in the nightmares of the survivors for the rest of their lives. As the fires reached their peak intensity, and with the aerial attacks making the streets lethal, the focus of the Greenwood residents shifted entirely to escape. They had to get out of the city's destruction zone, and fast. Thousands of people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, began a desperate flight. They ran toward the fringes of the city, seeking any refuge they could find. Many headed north and east, away from the core of Tulsa, into the open countryside. They hid in creeks, under bridges, and in the thick brush of the surrounding land. They moved under the cover of the thick, choking smoke that blotted out the early morning sun, praying the attackers wouldn't find them. Imagine the terror of a mother clutching her children, running from fire on one side and gunfire on the other, watching her entire life literally burn behind her. The flight was fraught with danger. The white mob had set up roadblocks and patrols on the main escape routes. Anyone caught was often harassed, robbed, or shot. Some residents found momentary safety in the homes of sympathetic white Tulsans who risked their own lives to hide their neighbors. A small, but important, detail of kindness in the overwhelming cruelty. However, for the majority, the journey was a harrowing, solitary scramble for survival. They had fled their burning paradise only to find themselves refugees in their own city. They left behind everything they owned, carrying only the trauma of what they had witnessed. The destruction of their homes was one thing, but the absolute loss of security and the realization that their neighbors wished them dead was the deepest wound. The official intervention, when it finally came, wasn't aimed at protecting the Black community or stopping the mob. It was aimed at controlling the trouble. Late on June 1st, Governor J.B.A. Robertson ordered the National Guard into Tulsa. But the National Guard, rather than arresting the white rioters who had committed murder and arson, began rounding up the Black survivors. Thousands of Black men, women, and children, many injured, dehydrated, and terrified, were systematically marched through the ravaged streets. They were escorted at gunpoint, often by armed National Guard members and deputized white citizens, many of whom had been part of the attacking mob, toward designated internment centers. These makeshift prisons included the fairgrounds, the convention hall, and even some schools. It was an astonishing reversal of justice. The victims were treated as the criminals. At the internment centers, survivors were essentially held prisoner. They were counted, registered, and forced to remain until white employers or local officials vouched for them. While there, they received basic medical care and food, but the psychological toll was immense. Families were separated. Men were often interrogated as if they were responsible for the destruction. The internment served two purposes for the city authorities. First, it removed the Black population from the downtown area, stopping the violence, and second, it provided a cover story. The official narrative would later attempt to frame the event not as a massacre committed by a white mob, but as a race riot, where both sides were equally at fault, making the victims' imprisonment seem like a necessary measure of order. The irony was devastating. They had escaped the fire only to be locked up by the very government meant to protect them. When the smoke finally cleared on the morning of June 2, 1921, the full scale of the destruction was laid bare. Greenwood, once a vibrant, prosperous community, was gone. 35 city blocks, home to over 10,000 Black residents, had been reduced to smoldering rubble. Where elegant brick buildings once stood, only charred foundations remained. The streets were littered with debris, shattered glass, and the personal belongings of families. Burnt furniture, torn clothing, children's toys, all covered in a thick layer of ash. The air still hung heavy with the acrid smell of smoke and death. What wasn't burned was looted. Every single business, church, school, and home within the affected area was either completely destroyed or severely damaged. The site was apocalyptic. It looked like a war zone, but there had been no war with a foreign enemy. This was the work of neighbors against neighbors, fueled by racial hatred and economic jealousy. Survivors who were eventually allowed back into the area walked through the ruins in a daze, searching for anything recognizable, any sign of their former lives. They poked through the ashes, sometimes finding a melted piece of jewelry, a half-burned photo, or the outline of what used to be their home. The immediate shock was profound, but underneath it was a deep, aching realization. Everything they had worked for, every investment, every dream for their children's future had been deliberately and ruthlessly destroyed. The physical scars on the land were overwhelming, but the emotional and psychological scars on the people were even deeper and would last for generations. The sheer emptiness of the landscape was a testament to the hatred that had swept through. The true human cost of the Tulsa Race Massacre remains one of its most tragic and contested aspects. Immediately after the destruction, official reports downplayed the casualties. The state of Oklahoma initially reported only 36 deaths, 10 white and 26 Black. This number was a deliberate lie, a desperate attempt to cover up the true scale of the atrocity. Most Black victims were buried in unmarked mass graves or simply disappeared, making an accurate count almost impossible. Survivors and historians, however, have pieced together a far grimmer picture. The American Red Cross, which came in to provide aid, estimated around 300 deaths. Other estimates from researchers and eyewitness accounts push that number even higher, suggesting hundreds, if not more, Black lives were lost. Many died in the fires, others from gunshot wounds, and still others from exposure or injuries sustained during their escape. Beyond the deaths, thousands were injured. Burns, bullet wounds, and blunt force trauma were common. Many lost everything they owned. The financial cost was staggering. What was then estimated at $1.5 million in damages, which translates to well over $30 million in today's money, was never fully compensated. Insurance companies largely denied claims, citing riot clauses that excluded coverage for such events. This meant that the victims were not only stripped of their property, but also denied any means of recovering their losses. The cost wasn't just monetary. It was the loss of generational wealth, the destruction of a thriving economic ecosystem, and the shattering of trust in a society that claimed to be founded on justice. Perhaps as devastating as the massacre itself was the immediate and systematic effort to erase it from history. For decades, the Tulsa Race Massacre was effectively swept under the rug. Official records were altered or disappeared. Photographs of the destruction were suppressed. The local white newspapers, which had inflamed the initial tensions, quickly changed their tune, minimizing the role of the white mob and portraying the event as a two-sided race riot for which black residents were equally responsible. School textbooks in Oklahoma made no mention of it. Generations of Tulsans, both black and white, grew up without ever learning about what happened on May 31st and June 1st, 1921. The silence was deafening, a collective amnesia imposed by those in power. Black survivors were often threatened with further violence if they spoke out. They lived with the trauma but were forced to bury the story, to pretend it never happened, for fear of reprisal. This cover-up served multiple purposes. It protected the reputations of those involved, avoided accountability, and allowed the racist narrative of black inferiority to persist unchallenged. The city wanted to move on, to forget the stain on its conscience. But for the survivors and their descendants, there was no forgetting. They carried the truth in their hearts and their oral histories, passing down the stories of what happened, even as the world around them denied its very existence. The systematic denial made healing almost impossible, transforming an open wound into a festering secret that slowly poisoned the community's soul. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, the city of Tulsa attempted one final, cruel measure: stopping Greenwood from rebuilding. The city government, citing public safety, tried to pass an ordinance that would have required all new construction in the area to use fireproof materials like brick and stone. This was a direct financial hit, as it was far more expensive than wood frame construction, and the city knew the newly impoverished black residents couldn't afford it. The goal was clearly to permanently halt the reconstruction of Black Wall Street, forcing the survivors to move away or settle for less. But the resilience of the Greenwood community was unbreakable. Attorneys for the black residents successfully challenged the ordinance, arguing that it was discriminatory and unconstitutional. Though they had lost their wealth and property, they still had their determination. Slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild. Using salvaged bricks, communal efforts, and an unwavering spirit, homes and businesses started to rise from the ashes. This second Black Wall Street, which emerged in the years following the disaster, was a testament to the community's refusal to be defeated. Within 10 years, they had rebuilt much of what was destroyed, demonstrating an almost superhuman will to succeed against overwhelming odds. But the new Greenwood was different. The collective financial loss was too deep, the psychological trauma too profound, and the fear of a repeat attack was always present. They rebuilt the structures, but they could never fully restore the innocence and confidence of the original Black Wall Street. They had been robbed not just of property, but of a decade of economic progress. For more than 50 years, the Tulsa Race Massacre remained a ghost story, whispered in black families but ignored by the official history books. The white community and the city government succeeded in burying the event so thoroughly that even many Oklahoma natives were unaware it had ever happened. It was a secret kept in plain sight. This enforced silence was a second layer of violence, denying the survivors the dignity of having their story acknowledged. The tide only began to turn in the late 1990s. Historians and local activists pushed for an official accounting. In 1997, the Oklahoma legislature established the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, later renamed the Tulsa Race Massacre Commission. This was a monumental step. The commission's investigation was thorough and painful. It interviewed survivors, examined old records, and concluded officially that the city and state had played a significant role in the events, not just by failing to protect black citizens, but by actively assisting the white mob and covering up the truth. The commission recommended reparations for the survivors and their descendants, but this recommendation was ultimately ignored by the legislature. The search for mass graves began, confirming the worst fears of the community that many more had died than officially admitted. This official acknowledgement broke the silence, finally validating the decades of trauma carried by the survivors. For the remaining elderly survivors, finally seeing the truth printed in government reports was a small, overdue measure of justice. Today, the Tulsa Race Massacre is no longer a hidden story. It has become a crucial, painful chapter in the American narrative, a stark example of how systemic racism and economic jealousy can lead to unimaginable destruction. Greenwood is now home to the Greenwood Cultural Center and the John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park, dedicated to remembering and teaching the events of 1921. The legacy of the massacre is complex. On one hand, it represents the absolute worst of American history, the deliberate destruction of black excellence and the subsequent decades of denial. On the other hand, it stands as an enduring symbol of African American resilience, the sheer will to survive and rebuild, even after facing such profound terror. The community's fight for reparations continues, as the economic impact of that day still echoes through the generations. The loss of that original Black Wall Street wealth is a direct cause of economic inequality felt in Tulsa today. The story of Tulsa is a reckoning. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, power, and historical memory. It reminds us that prosperity can breed resentment, and that when hate is allowed to run free, the consequences are devastating and long-lasting. By remembering the flames that consumed Greenwood, we honor the lives lost, the wealth destroyed, and the spirit that refused to be extinguished. The story isn't just about a past event, it's about the ongoing struggle for equity and recognition today. The story of Black Wall Street is not just a tragic event from the past, it's a living wound. It is a powerful lesson about what happens when fear and hatred are allowed to triumph over success and community. Imagine waking up the next day, seeing the ashes of your life, and realizing that the people sworn to protect you either stood by or joined the destruction. The resilience of the survivors is an incredible testament to the human spirit, but the injustice of the cover-up and the lack of full accountability still hang heavy in the air. We owe it to the victims and the survivors to keep this story alive. We owe it to ourselves to understand how hatred can destroy generations of hard work. What part of this story shocked you the most? If you found this history powerful and important, please hit that like button. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. And subscribe for more deep dives into the untold stories of American history.